hours on end. You've worked with them. What do you hope comes out of this for them?
Yeah, I mean, we are very close to getting an answer from the city. They ruled they had a settlement on February 3rd, and they were supposed to re-examine and give an answer in an expeditious amount of time. And then it's like 8, 9 months later. So a judge had the city respond to, hey, where's the re-examination on September 3rd, which was like 2 weeks ago, right? So now we believe that I think this will hold October 14th. The medical examiner's office has to give their answer. So we are, weeks away from the family hearing if the Philadelphia medical examiner's office, upon reexamination, is going to say that actually we need to call this undetermined, we don't know, or we're going to call this a homicide, or if they're going to double down and call it a suicide. So we really don't know. We're like hanging in the balance. What I hope for the family is that they feel that a thorough reexamination was done and the outcome matches the evidence. So even with a cleaned up crime scene, Ellen's body tells a story, and it's to my mind a very clear story. It's to many medical experts included, a very clear story. So I think the Greenbergs would like some truth coming out of the institutions.
And to that point, experts, the Greenbergs themselves, and the rest of the family, they believe that Ellen died by homicide. I know then Attorney General, now Governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, believes that evidence pointed to, at the time, suicide. When you're going through the making of this documentary and all of these conversations and looking at the evidence and going through that 911 call, did your perspective change at all? Or did you think, hey, there were some serious questions here and this just confirmed what I believed at the beginning?
I think there are absolutely questions that I do not have the answer to because there are no cameras. I wasn't there. I think anyone who thinks they know exactly what happened in this time frame, like I think that kind of stuff, that's where I get very hesitant because there's a lot of stuff we do not know. But I think, for me, which is also why I included the visuals of what happened to Ellen, normally I wouldn't do that, right? I wouldn't show graphic imagery of someone if it was just a clear cut. I mean, you might need to know this was what is called overkill, because 20 stab wounds is generally deemed overkill. It's not 3, it's 20. So because the city was doubling down on continuing to call this suicide, it was important for me to show the blunt force trauma wounding on the back of her head and the multiple wounding. Like that is it's so stark. So I think the bruising also indicated something else was going on as well. So I think diving really deeply in, there are more questions I have, but certainly calling this a suicide is something I would never believe.
Death in Apartment 603, What Happened to Ellen Greenberg, is out now. Where can people find it?
They can find it on September 29th. They can find it on Hulu.
Nancy Schwartzman, thank you so much for joining me. You're welcome back anytime. I know I really appreciated the project, and I hope everyone can have an opportunity to watch.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs. The villains in some of America's most iconic horror movies were inspired by crimes dating back to the 1950s, committed by real-life killer and grave robber Ed Gein. What police found in his Wisconsin house of horrors in 1957 rivaled any plot Hollywood screenwriters could imagine. An investigation into the disappearance of Bernice Worden, a shopkeeper who went missing, led authorities to Gein's home. There, they did find her body, mutilated and hanging upside down in a shed. That wasn't their only grisly discovery. They also found bowls made from skulls, human heads, women's body parts used to make furniture and household items, and both face masks and a woman's suit made out of human skin. The macabre findings, and Ed Gein's story, have had a lasting impact on pop culture for decades since. Most recently, Gein's story is spotlighted in the latest season of the Netflix series Monster. Harold Schechter, author of Deviant, the shocking true story of the original Psycho, joins Forbes True Crime to discuss the killer now known as the Butcher of Plainfield. Hi everybody, I'm Brittany Lewis, the host of Forbes True Crime. Joining me now is Harold Schechter, author of Deviant and Did You Hear What Eddie Gein Done? Harold, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
It has been close to 70 years since the infamous Ed Gein admitted to arguably some of the most horrific crimes in American history. And the story is being revisited now in the newest season of Netflix's Monster. But for those who might not be as familiar with the name Ed Gein, I'm sure they are familiar with his story that has inspired horror movies like Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Silence of the Lambs. But how would you describe the Butcher of Plainfield?
Well, first of all, there's one misconception about Ed Gein that needs to be corrected, which is he was not a serial killer. The term serial killer, which actually dates back to the 1930s, was specifically coined to describe a certain kind of sadistic sexual psychopath. And when it entered the language over here, because it was originally coined in Germany, it was used to describe or applied to killers like John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, the Night Stalker, etc. These were all extreme sadistic sex killers who derived their perverted pleasure from kidnapping and torturing and murdering helpless victims. That was not Ed Gein's MO. Gein was essentially a necrophile. He did kill 2 women, but he did not torture them. He did not subject them to these terrible atrocities in the way the killers I mentioned a moment ago did their victims. He basically dug up corpses, or in the case of his 2 victims, just created corpses. He executed these 2 women very swiftly. And he brought these bodies back to his remote farmhouse, dissected them, and made all of these ghastly objects out of their body parts. And a great deal of the fascination with Gein has to do exactly with that. All the stuff he made out of the body parts, which included a skin suit or part of a skin suit that he wore. And all of this pretty much had to do with his relationship with his mother, who was the overbearing, dominating figure in his life. And when she died, he tried to dig up her corpse and bring it home. And when he couldn't get to it, because it was buried in a concrete vault, he began digging up the bodies of women who resembled his mother, or in the case of his 2 murder victims, living women who resembled his mother. He was basically trying to resurrect his dead mother. And that's where a lot of the fascination with the Gein case comes from, because it was such a macabre crime taking place in the American heartland during this sunny, balmy Eisenhower era.
I'm actually really happy that you started with some of the misconceptions here, and arguably one of the biggest ones when it comes to Ed Gein, because he was a murderer, a grave robber, he mutilated corpses. When you, in your book Deviant, described the House of Horrors, I was listening to the audiobook and I was on a run and I was by myself, kind of in a wooded area. And I mean, it freaked me out so much that I got out of that wooded area as fast as I could. My split for that mile was incredible. That's how fast I was running. But his house was horrifying with what he did to body parts, how he used them for household items and furniture, face masks, the woman's suit made out of skin. I mean, why do you think there are misconceptions when it comes to Gein, especially because the reality is twisted enough?
Well, first of all, at least in popular entertainment, we're obsessed with serial killers. Serial killers have become the mythic monster of our age. So it's very easy, people who make these movies and documentaries and so on want to slot him into that category. And even at the time, people assumed, though the term did not exist, when they first found all these body parts in his farmhouse, that they had come from living victims. So the immediate suspicion was that Gein was, again, they didn't have the term serial killer back then. They would have called him a mass murderer. So that label, is easy to apply to Gein. And in some respects, Gein's crimes are so unimaginable, so unspeakable, so beyond the bounds of human comprehension that it's easier to categorize him as a serial killer than to describe him as what he was, for which no term, I mean, I say necrophile, but he wasn't really even a classic necrophile. Necrophilia refers to having sex with corpses. Gein, as far as we know, never consummated a sexual relationship with any of these dead bodies. He was using them, as you were saying a moment ago, to create all these ghastly objects and even to dress up in the flayed skin of his victims. So I guess what I'm saying is serial killer is just an easier way to think of him.
And people like Ed Gein only admitted to killing 2 women, but people do believe and suspect that he's had more victims. You are one of the leading experts when it comes to all things Ed Gein. You've written 2 books about him. What do you think, based on your research, your years of research, do you think he's had more victims, committed more crimes?
No, I don't. I think that the murders of the tavern keeper, Mary Hogan, and Bernice Warden, who ran the local hardware store, were his only homicides. When a sensational killer is arrested, police who have all these cold cases, flock to interview the accused perpetrator, hoping to solve these crimes. And every, unsolved murder in Wisconsin, basically, was attributed for a while to Ed Gein. But I don't believe Gein committed any but those 2 murders.
You pointed out in Deviant, too, that Ed Gein was seen as very unassuming. He was seen perhaps and portrayed perhaps in his community as a weirdo, as someone who was a strange guy, but no one who anyone would suspect of, committing these really monstrous crimes. The person that he was in his community did not square with these crimes that people found out about after. So do you think that that's where a lot of the fascination surrounding Ed Gein comes from?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. You know, that I sometimes have described Gein as uh, Barney Fife with a chainsaw. You know, he just seemed like this completely harmless, little oddball. So, the absolute split between his public persona, how people perceived him, which in many ways is what he was, and what was going on in his farmhouse was so extreme that a lot of the fascination derives, as you were saying, from that. Just this. Well, again, Alfred Hitchcock tapped into that, this incredible schizoid doubleness, which was part of the culture also. The fact that the Gein crimes happened in the midst of this sunny, optimistic, benign, white bread era America, and then in the middle of the country, in this farmhouse, Wisconsin farmhouse, you had this guy performing these hideous rituals. Again, that split, between what was going on in the country and these activities, the split between Gein's public, uh, public persona as this harmless, kind of, very mild mannered, uh, slightly goofy individual, and the things that were taking place in his home does account for a lot of the fascination with him.
And Mary Hogan was a someone who worked at a tavern. She went missing in 1954, and then it was later revealed Ed Gein admitted to killing her. And something that stuck out to me, and you note this in your book Deviant, is Ed Gein would joke and say every time Mary Hogan was brought up, he would say, yeah, she's back at the house or something to that effect. And people thought it was, an off-putting joke, maybe a little morbid humor, but they certainly did not suspect, hey, he's actually serious and her body is at his house and has been for years. So I think that really illustrates the double identity, really, of Ed Gein. But like I said in this conversation, you are an expert on his story. There's so many shocking, disturbing, grisly facts. What is the most shocking to you?
Well, the whole everything that went on is shocking. I mean, let me make a point about why I think uh, Gein has maintained this fascination. He's really become a kind of mythic figure, which is why his story continues to be told and retold in all these different versions. And I wasn't a true crime writer when I wrote Deviant. I had been writing books on various subjects. And Gein was not really well known at that time. I mean, he certainly was known among a certain fringe element of true crime aficionados. But what interested me about the Gein case was that I came to see him as a kind of supernatural or fairy tale monster come to life. If you look at any community, kids are always telling stories about some weird, there's always some weird guy or old woman living off the beaten path. And kids invent all these stories, about their witches or cannibal ogres or whatever. I grew up in the Bronx in a 6-story apartment building, and there was a weird old woman living on the 6th floor. And we used to tell stories about, that she was a witch, et cetera, et cetera. She was just a harmless cat lady. Or it's like To Kill a Mockingbird, Boo Radley. I mean, that happens all the time. In the Gein case, it was really true. Something like Hansel and Gretel. You want, off a little ways outside of the community, there's this creepy house with some weird guy living in it. And then it turns out, yeah, he was this monster. So there's something, as I said, almost kind of mythic about the story.
To that point, he really did go from this local ghost story legend to the most infamous killer in American history, one of them today. Every neighborhood has that type of person you see. I remember across the street from my neighborhood, there was this semi-abandoned farmhouse, a bunch of cats, and on the bus every day going to school, all the kids would think of a different story associated to that house. But do you think this fascination when it comes to Ed Gein, do you think really we saw that from when the story started in the 50s to now? Do you think that was really the origin of the true crime industry and this fascination with true crime that we know today?
No. I wrote the interest in true crime dates at least as far back as the invention of the Gutenberg press. I was actually asked to be this year a consultant for the Guinness Book of World Records. They were doing a true crime section that just came out recently. And one of the entries that's in the book that I supplied had to do with the oldest true crime book in English, which dates back to Shakespeare's time. People have always been fascinated by true crime. I was also asked to edit an anthology for the Library of America called True Crime in American Anthology. And the first piece that appears in it dates back to the Mayflower Pilgrims. So there's nothing new about the public interest in true crime. Again, it has existed for as long as, well, in print, it's existed for as long as there has been such a thing as print. And it existed before that in terms of oral, what they call murder ballads. Every time a sensational murder happened, somebody would turn it into a poem or a song, and it would be transmitted that way. And certainly in the United States, I guess the modern fascination with crime began 1966, I guess, with Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. So again, the thing with Ed Gein is, this relates to what I was saying before. In a way, he's never so much been part of true crime. His story has always been adapted into horror, which is a very different genre. He was this flesh and blood fairy tale monster whose story lends itself to being told and retold in horror stories.
And he's different from other notorious criminals in American history, like Ted Bundy, like Jeffrey Dahmer, because their names are so much more well known. I mean, Ed Gein obviously is infamous, but his story has been sliced for movies like Psycho, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like Silence of the Lambs, and the character has a different name there. So what do you think his impact then on true crime is?
On true crime?
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think I hate to keep repeating myself. I mean, it's obviously true crime because it's, nonfiction. It actually happened. But Gein's influence really has, through Psycho to begin with, primarily been on the genre of horror. I see Gein as I grew up in the 1950s. I'm a baby boomer. And all the monsters in horror movies at that time came from somewhere else. Dracula from Transylvania, and the Wolfman, there's a Wolfman of London, and Frankenstein from whatever Eastern European country that was, or alien invaders from Mars. They were all foreign. Norman Bates was the first really all-American monster, and Ed Gein stands behind Norman Bates. So in that sense, uh, I think the Gein story Americanized horror in our culture. That has really been his primary impact.
Most recently, Ed Gein's story is being told on the newest season of Monster, the Netflix series created by Ryan Murphy, and past seasons include the Menendez brothers, as well as the story of Jeffrey Dahmer. And in the past, both Ryan Murphy and the series have faced criticisms, and those criticisms include re-traumatizing victims and their families, not consulting victims and their families for the stories. They've also been accused of adding moments that don't accurately portray or sensationalize exactly what happened, or glamorizing the killers. So A, what do you think of Gein's story being told this way? And do you think that it could be subject to similar criticism?
Well, I don't think it'll be criticized in terms of upsetting or offending families of victims, because it happened over 75 years ago. When I first went to Plainfield to do my research, there were still living relatives of Gein's victims. And the people of Plainfield were very, very sensitive at that time about anybody coming in to, as they saw it, exploit the story. As the years went by and the older generation passed, I think they've more embraced the notoriety, that the Gein story has brought them. So as far as that goes, I don't think they're liable to come into much criticism. As far as the other question goes, I mean, I myself am going to be watching it with great interest because nobody bothered to reach out to me from Ryan Murphy's camp to see, how they treat the material. I mean, from what I've seen of the trailers, again, they've turned it into another kind of over-the-top horror movie. They seem to have taken a lot of liberties with the story, which is fine. Again, Gein has achieved this mythic status, so any creator is entitled to treat that myth the way they see fit. But I am very curious and will be watching the series this weekend, to see how they treat the story.
That's really interesting that they didn't reach out to you because, I mean, you're the leading expert here on Ed Gein. I've read multiple stories from different media outlets on this upcoming series, and you're quoted in a lot of them. So what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I think such things happen quite often in Hollywood. I don't feel comfortable saying too much about it until I actually see the series. But I will say, before Deviant came out, I think Gein's story, as it has become known, all derives from my book. Because before that, it was just a bunch of newspaper articles and magazine articles and Life and so on. So again, I'm going to be interested to see how the series treats the story and to what, if any extent, it has relied on my book.
That's really interesting. I know in the past there have been series where, like I said before, Ryan Murphy's been accused of glamorizing killers. He's not the only person to have done that. I mean, Zac Efron, who has been considered a heartthrob for my generation, portrayed Ted Bundy. You have Charlie Hunnam portraying Ed Gein. And he has, based on the trailer, the droopy eye that you describe of Ed Gein. But I mean, he's a pretty good looking actor. What do you think that does to Ed Gein's legacy being portrayed in that way?
Well, the pictures I see, I mean, facially, Hunan has been made to look somewhat like Gein, who is actually, when you see him in certain photographs, a good looking enough guy. he obviously did not have the ripped physique of that we see in some of the promotional material for the show. Um, I just think it will make Gein, more widely known. I don't have any problem. Look, I mean, throughout American history, psychopathic killers have been glamorized and turned into myths. You look at somebody like Jesse James or Billy the Kid. I mean, these guys were psychopathic. I mean, they really were serial killers in a way. Um, but they've been turned into handsome, they've been played by movie idols and so on and so forth. So, in that regard, I don't have any problem with the way anybody might treat the Gein story. I mean, my only problem is presenting it, as strictly factual, because again, from the little I've seen of the series, they've taken quite a few liberties with the facts, which again, I don't have any problem with, except if people assume that that was what really happened.
And that's been a problem since the 50s. You wrote in your book that media coverage, stories were going from fact to fiction really fast. People could not get enough of these stories. And even, this is one of your quotes, townspeople felt exploited and victimized by the press, but there was fact and fiction that was embroidered and people couldn't differentiate between what was what. I mean, what do you think of that sensationalized media coverage that was happening then and could potentially be happening still over 70 years later, or close to 70 years later?
Well, I think, Ryan Murphy's Monster is not being offered as journalism. And there's a long history in American journalism of this kind of sensationalized tabloid coverage and these wild rumors being spread around in the immediate aftermath of the discovery of these crimes. I'm writing a book now about a serial killer from the 1890s, and the same thing happened with him. As soon as he was